My father was a pastor and a preacher, not all of my life, but most of my life. I don't come from a lineage of preachers. I know some of my peers who are like fourth generation pastors, not me. So I didn't enter the ministry with that kind of pedigree. My father was a minister. I got to know preachers because my father was a preacher pastor. He was a good pastor. I got to see him study. He went back to school, even while he had children in school. He was a good preacher and good pastor. So in a sense, he was my first model. What I learned from him, the thing that made the biggest impact on my father is never quit. That's one thing I've learned from him. He was a good preacher, but he wasn't a well-known, preacher in the regard. In his circles, he was considered, the cream of the crop. I watched him study, so I knew how important it is to study. And I got to know preachers because of him. But the biggest impact he made on my life. And what is interesting is my father said this to me. He said, sometimes I feel like God called me to call you. That's what he said to me. So in that sense, he made an impact. But in terms of, so he was a good role model in terms of watching him pastor people. In Florida, he was pastoring 2 churches. They had first and third, second and fourth, and he'd go to one place and one to the other, and he had to drive to both, and he was faithful. I mean, I watched him do that, do visitation as well as preaching. In terms of mentors, in terms of preaching, people who impressed me in terms of preaching, I used to hear about, first of all, preachers that J.H. Jackson, and my dad and them used to talk about them. I used to hear about them. So what I heard kind of piqued my interest. And then, of course, everybody wanted to be Martin Luther King. So, I was struck by the fact that you could bring the mind to preaching the way he did. Because I didn't want to be a preacher. If you wanted to get in a fight, tell me I was going to be a preacher. And like my daddy, I love my daddy, but I'm not going to be nobody's preacher. So and one of the reasons why is because some of the models, it didn't appeal to me because it didn't bring the mind to the craft. So he was one. Of course, he brought mind and eloquence and passion. And of course, given his legacy in life, made an impact as a consequence. But there are others who, one of them was, the early ones was Charles Adams. I used to hear him on tape before I met him, on cassette. That shows you how long ago it was. And I was struck when I heard him preach. I didn't know you could preach like that. He was a good combination. He's a good wordsmith. He used the manuscript well. But what he put in sermons, I didn't know you could do it. The data he put in and how he did it without putting you to sleep. I mean, you can't go to sleep on anything that he preaches. His imagination was incredible. And the relevance of his preaching, to have all of that in one package. So to hear him communicate so well. So he made a big impact on me. And so I used to listen to a lot of him. I can still remember some of the titles of some of the sermons that are just legendary sermons. And Fred Sampson, when I was a student at Southern, I went through the archives and found him. He had done a kind of a revival at Southern, and that was when Dr. Honeycutt was there. He said, I want you to come and preach at Southern. I want you to, at Southern Seminary, and I want you to do what you do at your own church. And, he's the Shakespeare of preachers. And so his capacity for communication, there's never a dull moment. But the depth and breadth of what he brought, biology, psychology, or he could quote Shakespeare, or he'll quote some obscure theologian like Teilhard de Chardin. And not only he would quote Teilhard de Chardin and not theology, he'll quote a prayer that who reads about a prayer from the guy who wrote Don't Make a Point? So, but he would do it in such a way, and he used to be a pastor, I found out when I got there, in Louisville, and I'm always amazed that Louisville let him get away. He was amazing. And so for him, his imagination as well made a big impact. E.K. Bailey also was one who made a big impact. He was kind of a combination of old school, new school, but he didn't use a manuscript like Samson, but he studied really hard, wrote it all out, and was very effective in his communicative capacity as well. So, and then finally, my own mentor, Jeremiah Wright, I did my doctorate with him in Joannes Kunjufu, and you know, studying with him was ridiculous. So I liked his combination of being, he's a good combination. He's known for being prophetic, but I know his people know he's known for being priestly too. So he's a good prophet and a good pastor. And to see that combination of the two expressed in his preaching as well. He could do it, have a priestly sermon and prophetic sermon, or do both in the same sermon. And so I was really influenced by him, and he sent me to other people that he admired, Samuel Proctor and others, so I got to read about them and meet them because of him. And so the others kind of mentored me from afar. He was a more direct, he and my father were more direct mentors in terms of preaching.